Calaroga Shark Media.
I've got a great one for you today. My guest is Jason Zinoman, critic at large for the culture section of the New York Times. Jason writes a column about comedy, and we talked comedy for the better part of an hour on his bio page on the NewYorkTimes.com. Jason writes, I cover comedy with critical rigor and curiosity and explore how it reflects and influences the broader cultural and intellectual landscape. I'm particularly interested in work that is innovative or unexpected, but it's enough if it's just really funny. My aim is to always capture the comedy scene and its complexity while translating it clearly for a broad audience. That is a theme that came up several times during this discussion. I just want to give you some notes on the recording here. So we recorded this on a program called Squadcast, basically Zoom for podcasters. And when you do that, you don't quite get studio quality sound, and sometimes you get little dropouts. The reason I'm bringing this up is I just want to be clear. There were 3 different points where I used a program called Descript, which has a feature called Regenerate, where I used it to regenerate short phrases said by Jason. Nothing materially changed. The words aren't changed. It just regenerated the wave so that it didn't fade a little bit. Just want to be clear about that. Also, when I use Descript, it has a couple of neat buttons that I use every day on this podcast. One is remove retakes. So when I record every day, believe me, I stumble and I start over, and Descript has a 1-button remove retakes. It's wonderful. There's also a feature that I used on this interview, which is remove filler words, because when you listen to Johnny Mac speak the way Johnny Mac does over the course of an hour, there are a lot more ums and you knows than you might get during a typical 10-minute script that I've edited down. And there's also a 1-button click called shorten word gaps, which just tightens the pacing. So I've used all those features on this interview. Nothing materially changed, but I just want to be clear that I did, in a traditional podcasting way, nothing nefarious, I did edit the audio. All right. Here's my interview with Jason. I've been a fan of your work. I don't even know how to explain it. It's not stupid. There's a lot of stupid in comedy, and I don't feel like you do takes. I feel like you write really thoughtful, smart pieces, and I've been quoting you in episodes for months, and then the other day I freaked out. I go, wait, what if his name is pronounced Zinoman and I've said it wrong 45 times? And then I actually checked. I was like, shh. Anyway. So I'm curious about your approach as someone who just does off the top of his head 10-minute podcasts and maybe a half-ass written Substack. I know how long it takes me to do that. So to appreciate what you're doing for the New York Times also, you got to be putting in a ton of work.
First of all, let me say, if you call me Zinoman, I'm not going to complain. It's like cinnamon, but I'll take any reference. I'll take any PR is good PR. And Zinoman sounds also always more like the superhero version of my name. But yeah, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. Although that makes it sound, sometimes it comes very easily, as I'm sure. And sometimes more work doesn't always mean better work, is one thing I've learned. And that's one thing that's evolved over the course of this. For instance, I would say, when I started this job, I spent a huge amount of time, most of my time, going out to see shows, clubs, and I still do that, but I don't do it as much as I used to. And that has to do both with how comedy's changed, but also I think that I try to spend a little bit of time every week thinking about, letting my mind roam and thinking of ideas. And then if I have a good idea, I try to find the right form for it. So sometimes that's a review, sometimes it's an essay, sometimes it's a bigger piece, sometimes a profile. And it's funny, sometimes like the things that I write in an hour or a half hour are the most popular, and the things that I sweat over, like I'm working on something now for months and no one cares.
I feel like I totally know that one.
Yes. And sometimes they're wrong, but they're not always wrong. Sometimes you cannot trust you. Let's put it this way: I'm first a critic, and I'm a big believer in something. I'm a big believer that your first impression isn't always right, but it's always important. So you have to be really sensitive to your first impression of something, and it's why people like Pauline Kael, who's probably the critic who most inspired me as a kid. She would go see a movie and go home and write the review right away. And because she really valued that first impression.
I'm happy to hear that you're not clubbing as much as you used to. One of my guilt trips, I ran SiriusXM comedy for 10 years ago now, But even then, it was hard to go see shows because I was still expected to be in the office and be a manager from 8 a.m. until 6, call it. So to stay out to 1:30 in the morning doing shows was difficult. I tended to rely on the people who were younger on my staff. And then to keep my knowledge fresh, I'd hit festivals. And as I always tell this audience, if you go to a festival, don't go see Chris Rock. You can go see Chris Rock some other time. Go hit all those smaller shows. That's where the action is. I'm upset that Montreal is gone or perhaps back or this new group that bought it. But no Montreal this summer is a bummer.
It's interesting to hear what you do because I think that's a very smart strategy. I have taken the opposite approach, which isn't necessarily better, which is that if anything, I undercover festivals because I feel like a lot of the people you see at festivals, I already see in New York. But what that means is like comedians from other cities, when they come through here, I make a point of trying to see them, or I try to go to LA periodically to see that, but I miss things for sure. And there's no question that you could, it's funny. The truth is that there's like a pool of performers in New York. And if you go often enough, you see them all and it's changing, but it doesn't change radically. It doesn't change like the number of people change. I still like to go and I think I pick up things, I learn things from going. But now the thing is, you could probably, the most time efficient way is probably just to look at your computer and follow because everyone's online and there's so much material online. And a lot of consumers of comedy are first accessing comedy, not from clubs, but from a clip on a TikTok or Instagram. So that has to change. I feel like if the way that we have to evolve along with the consumers.
Yeah. And for any content creator, no matter the format, we're all living in a headline world, right? So the easiest thing to write is why Joe Rogan, Shane Gillis, and Nikki Glaser are something. That'll get the clicks as opposed to, hey, guys, Gianmarco Ceresi's awesome. Just it doesn't do the same.
But Ceresi will contact you and be like, how come you're not writing about me?
He's fantastic. Switching gears, one of the main things I wanted to talk to you about, Dave Chappelle. It bothers me that he has seemingly chosen to turn his legacy into the second line in his obit is going to be something about the trans community. And he's so much better than what he's done on the last few specials, which is, Jason, you know why I had you on today? Because of the trans. And he slaps his knee and he mugs for the camera and he gets a laugh. And he's so much better than that. And I don't know why he's dug in on that. I'd be curious to your thoughts.
It's a good question. Look, I love Dave Chappelle. I wrote an ebook on Dave Chappelle 8 years ago, searching for Dave Chappelle. I grew up in Washington, D.C., where he's from. I'm around he's a few years older than me, but I've been following his career since the 80s. He's an incredible comedian. His sketch show, I think people have now forgotten about it, but it's one of the greatest comedies ever on television. And he's one of the greatest stand-ups. I think it's his first special is terrific. And he still has a lot. I say all this as a way to be like, I'm agreeing with you. And one of the reasons it's depressing is that when we talk about Dave Chappelle, we tend to talk about these culture war things. And because that's what he's put forth. And so why has he chosen to do that? I think Gerard Carmichael asked a similar question recently. My sense, I'm just speculating, is that Chappelle always prized his freedom, prized his independence. I think the good faith, genuine interpretation is that when he did trans jokes and people got offended or said, don't do it, his first instinct is to then double down, right? And that's always been his first instinct. It's been his first instinct through his whole career. We can go chapter and verse even before he was famous. I've written about before his Chappelle show. He had a big falling out on his comedy on a ABC show called Buddies. I've traced this impulse has served him in this case. Look, it may have served him well for his audience. He's still selling out. He's still popular, but for his art, I agree with you. I think it's kept him in a rut. And I'm still optimistic when I see a new Dave Chappelle thing. I hope he moves past it. But yeah, what's interesting to me, the last one came out, is that I don't even think it caused that much controversy. I think people are just bored.
Yeah. I imagine in your travels, you've run into him. He'll do sets, and I'm being generous with that. He'll take stage time, and he's not even really working out. He's just talking to the audience when he does that downbeat, soft-spoken Dave, and he'll just come out with some brilliant things just to listen to that maybe aren't even funny, and he's got that there. And I'd like to just see him do something else. But to your point, Dave Chappelle announced his new Netflix special. Already the conversation is going to be, is he going to bring this up again? And I think you nailed it. It's boring.
It's predictable. I mean, like, if you were to say, like, what's the least interesting thing for him to do next, it would be to talk about that again. That's the part of it which is flabbergasting. I think that the other issue might be is that he always had these two modes, which was doing like a stand-up set with more traditional collection of jokes in his very idiosyncratic style, and what you described, this, like, he would go into club and he would be on stage for 4 hours, and there was something incredible about those sets. He could go places that others could not, and I believe he fell in love with that. There's something indulgent about those, and I think that's true for not just in terms of the amount of time he's spending there, but also they became very self-serious. This bothers me less than other people, but I think another reason people got bored with them is that his material seemed less punchline driven. It seemed less about being funny and more about being profound. And if he's saying things that are profound and poetic, that's fine. And maybe it's better than fine. It's great. But if he's saying the same thing over and over again, that's a problem.
All right. New premise. Off all the recent protests that Jerry Seinfeld ran into, I find myself wondering, what if Jerry went political? Now, I know that's crazy. He's 70 years old, and it's very easy to just write it out and go, hey, did you ever notice? But what if Jerry showed off and went all in? Could you ever imagine that in a million years?
No. But I mean, I would be interested. I think there's another question which is similar, which is, what if he went vulnerable or introspective, personal? And I think there's room for that. I think people would be interested in either him going political. I don't think he wants to, and I don't think he has to. I don't even think he's going to come. From the last interview I saw from him, he doesn't seem like he wanted to come out with any special ever again. And he wouldn't need to. He wouldn't need to. See, and people forget, but he came up at a time when everyone didn't need to release specials, and he didn't. For most of his career, he didn't release specials, and he did just fine. Some people think that he has gotten more political, but I'm with you. I don't think he has.
I found all the backlash to the Pop-Tarts movie bizarre. I liked it. I thought this is a silly movie. We're having fun. My friends are in it. Why don't you turn your brain off for 90 minutes? And people seemed like mad that movie even exists.
It was weird. I know what you mean. I think some people were mad about the interviews in which he said things like, the PC left and we're ruining sitcoms or whatever. But yeah, there was the initial response from I think one film critic called it the worst movie of the decade or the year or something. And I was like, that made no sense to me. That made zero, that there's something going on outside of the screen to think that a movie with that ambition, and also that there's plenty of talent on screen there, is the worst movie.
And it's not when
I say ambition, low ambition. It's not a movie that's swinging for the fences.
Yeah, it's not like he made some bro dude version of Oppenheimer and missed the politics of it. It's a Pop-Tarts movie.
Yes, it's a Pop-Tart. It's a bizarre response, but that's the age we're living in, right? That I think the more hyperbole you mentioned, if you put Joe Rogan in the title, it gets a lot of hits. The other way to get it is to have a more extreme point of view, right?
All right, we'll take the break here. Back with Jason Zinoman after this. The roast of Tom Brady. I feel like it cut through, seems to have done well. Did Nikki Glaser step up in class? Did Tony Hinchcliffe step up in class? Are these now names that the civilians would know? Actually, let me sidebar there. This comes up a lot. There are a lot of really popular comedians, but if you and I walk down the street and grab 100 people in New York City and said, hey, Andrew Schultz, what are we going, 3 for 100?
I think you're right. Yeah, no, you're putting your finger on a big phenomenon of the moment, which is like, what does it mean to be a famous comedian in 2024? Andrew Schultz played Madison Square Garden.
Right.
And there was a time when that was like hardly nobody had played Madison Square Garden. But he's played Madison Square Garden, and as you said, I think most people don't know who he is. But I think that's not just a question of comedy. That's a question of the culture in general, which is that it's so fragmented, it's so balkanized that as long as you have very passionate fans in your niche, you can sell a lot and be very successful, even without being widely known. I think it's also answers the previous question, which is that why is everyone so worried about Jerry Seinfeld? All the people who became famous in that generation have a kind of fame that's way bigger than the kind of fame you get now, with the exception of Taylor Swift. If you manage to get famous, even Rogan, I think, is an example of this, where Rogan likes to act like he's anti-establishment, anti-mainstream media. But I have this sort of pet theory that the difference between his fame and Tim Dillon, Andrew Schultz, who will never be as famous as Joe Rogan, is that Joe Rogan was on Fear Factor, and Joe Rogan was on news radio, and he hosted after Bob Costas left later, he had an NBC talk show for a second. Though that's a bigger fame than these podcast fames that you get now. It's a kind of fame that reaches a much broader demographic than you reach now.
I must have erased from my brain. There was a Joe Rogan late night show?
I did a piece a year ago. It seems already maybe longer than that. It seems very dated, when Daily Show was doing rotating guest hosts. And I was making an argument for how this might not be a terrible idea to do permanently. This is before they announced Jon Stewart, which is a better idea, or once a week. But although I guess they still do. I guess they are doing rotating guest hosts around with Jon Stewart. And I was looking around for precedent. And I realized that in the late 90s, NBC did this after, I may be getting some of the details wrong, but it's in my story, after, Letterman. And they had a crazy series of people who hosted for a week, then a week. And among those people were Joe Rogan. And he interviewed MMA people. He interviewed it was a similar version to his podcast, but it was on NBC. And I was really shocked. I couldn't find any versions of it online, but I nailed it down that it happened. I found it on old TV Guide listings.
Oh, wow. You're going to send me down a rabbit hole. And I didn't forget, I will circle back to my Nikki Glaser question, but now I'm 3 questions deep. I just had Mark Malkoff on, and he re-triggered my late night obsession. And I spent the week watching YouTube videos, and somebody made this homebrew thing about the Carson, Letterman, Tom Snyder trifecta. And I'm back into that whole move. And I know you wrote a Letterman book. Can you explain to me why I worship 12:30 Letterman, lasted a year and a half at 11:30 Letterman, after spending a decade going, man, if only I didn't have to stay up till 1:30 in the morning. If only Dave were on at 11:30, I would watch Dave every night. And then a year and a half into it, I don't know if it was just I was in my mid-20s and going out and doing things people do and not watching late night TV. But 12:30 Letterman is my North Star. 11:30 Letterman, okay. And then he'll put out something on Netflix and it takes me 3 weeks to watch it. What is wrong with me?
It's so funny that you asked me this question today, because you and I are identical on this point. And just today, somebody sent me a podcast in which it was the guy who was the Letterman podcast, Mike Chrism.
Yep.
And he said, I mentioned you on a podcast, and he was on a podcast with somebody else. Sorry to be on a podcast talking about another podcast, but my name came up, and it was asking, I guess the podcast host said, did you press him when he was on your podcast about why he focuses so much on his late night 12:30 show and not on his CBS show? And they were upset, both of them, because they both like the CBS show. And it made me wonder for a second, because putting aside me for a second, I think to people who are younger, who maybe didn't grow up with that show, the CBS show means more. But I've watched both as an adult. So my opinions on them are not just like nostalgic. And despite what they said in this podcast, the reason I didn't is because I agree with you that from 1982 to 93, David Letterman on NBC made some of the most brilliant talk show comedy and most innovative talk show comedy ever, that really created a sensibility, invented all kinds of forms, mainstreamed a sort of irony that is really significant, that will be, to your point about legacy, that will be the lion's share of his legacy. Now, his first couple years on the CBS show are probably arguably the more popular and were covered more because of the late night wars. And some of them were quite good. And there were periods in the CBS show that were better or worse. But in my opinion, the NBC show was vastly more ambitious and better than the CBS show. Now, that again, there are big exceptions. Certainly his response to 9/11 and many other ones. He still was David Letterman. He still was doing great work. And my book is essentially a book-length answer to the question of why, right? If you want to know why that is, buy my book, Letterman, Last China Late. And part of it has to do with him. Part of it has to do with the network. But a lot of it has to do with what's around him and the writers around him and the relationship between the writers and Letterman and all that. I would say that you were just smart and discriminating. And that's why.
I think what attracted me to it was the whole 12:30 vibe. And once Conan found his fastball, he's had the same vibe of maybe this bit isn't working, but I know it, you know it, we all know it. Let's just stick to it and laugh together with it. And then you go to 11:30, which is a different animal, and you have to wear an Armani suit, and you have to wear shoes. And it just was more, I've always called it establishment Letterman, as opposed to the 12:30, like, we're off our game tonight. We got 47 minutes left, whatever.
Yep. No, I think it was clearly a bigger, more show-busy show in a big theater where the previous show was intimate and it felt like conspiratorial between the viewer and Dave, and it was going backstage and doing all these fourth wall breaking things. It was very different. I would make the argument that it was the things that really made him unique. The new version of CBS was going directly against. That doesn't mean that he was totally different. He still had some of that irreverence. And I think what's interesting, you bring up what he's doing now. It's remarkable if you would have told me, the young version of me who loved his late night show, that Letterman would be now doing a show in which he interviews famous people and is incredibly complimentary and gushing about all of them and solicitous. What made him really stand out as an interviewer in the 80s, and you could just go and look at the press on this, is he adopted a kind of almost hostile, if not skeptical, attitude towards the celebrities who came on and promoted. And that was part of his appeal. So it's interesting. I don't blame him. But it's quite a 180.
The next rabbit hole I want to go down is trying to track down clips of his daytime show. Until I watched that Homebrew doc this week, I had no idea that Petrix or Viewer Mail were leftovers from the daytime show. I've barely seen clips of that.
It's incredible.
Are they out there?
There are. Yeah. If you go on YouTube, they're not all of them, but a huge number of them. And he and Meryl Marco, a lot of the great stuff from the late night, if not most of it, were established in the morning show. And they had Andy Kaufman has maybe one of the most brilliant appearances ever was on the morning show. There's an incredible Steve Martin appearance. I'm pretty sure they definitely did Stupid Petrix first in the morning show. I think they might have done Viewer Mail. A lot of the Man on the Street stuff. Hal Gurney, the director, started with him on the morning show, started there. It was the wrong time slot, but they were trying things there that the blueprint was established there. And just when they figured it out, they got canceled. And I think that's what was the secret sauce to the show, is that by the time that they started on late night, they had a much better sense of what they wanted to do than they would have if they didn't have a morning show.
When I recently watched Mulaney, I went for a whole ride here. So just to catch you up on my resume, a big chunk of it, I worked in talk radio WR New York and did a lot of phone screening, which is relevant to what I'm setting up here. As I was watching Mulaney, my initial reaction was, oh my goodness, 12:30 Dave is back. This is so loose and goofy, and I loved it. And then I started screaming, and this is arrogant, somebody needs to produce this thing. And my sticking point was when they went to callers, because as a call screener, I can tell you, civilians cannot tell a story. And I'm screaming at my TV saying, Jerry Seinfeld is sitting there. I could have hosted that and went, hey, Jerry, how's that movie going? And then shut up for 10 minutes. And did you enjoy Mulaney? I really think something's there. I'd like to see more of it just, and maybe this is counter to my whole 12:30 Letterman argument, a little more focused.
No, I'm with you. I really enjoyed it because I like novelty and I like experimentation and I like things that are different. So I was tickled by it. And just like you, it felt, oh, there are bits of cable access. There are bits of, we just with super famous people, there are bits of old Letterman. But it was interesting, the incongruity between the critics' reaction, which was pretty glowing, and normal people's reaction, which almost most people who I talked to loathed it or found it unwatchable, including, I should say, I'm not going to name it, but it was on my Facebook page, people who worked for the first Letterman show.
Oh, wow.
And I think the reason for that is, one is what you're saying, is that like he indulged a lot. There was a lot of dead air. There was like having the call in go on while you have these other people on the show. It was the thing that made it exciting, which is it's like anything can happen here, is also what can make it tedious. And if it was on for a month or a year, I think that would have been more clear. That would become, people are now saying, oh, we should do it full time. And I saw he did an interview where he was like, I'm intrigued, but I think that this was great for a week during a Netflix festival where they could get every star in the world on it. And it was a lark. If it was a permanent thing, I think its flaws that you've enumerated would be more clear.
Yeah, I wear many hats, and in my career as a podcasting executive and back as a programmer at Sirius, I would explain to people, talk to me about show 23, because even I can call on some celebrity favors, and I can book a great week of shows just for myself. What happens when it's week 47, and to your point, Jerry Seinfeld's not in town? Who are you talking to? Who's the guest? Now it's back on the host. They'll sample for the guest. They will come back for the host, is the way I teach that.
Let me ask you, how the call-in aspect, what works in that? What do you have to do to make that? Because obviously that was a huge part of popular culture for a long time. That was one of the things about that Mulaney show that I was like, it's interesting that he's doing this. It's not quite working, but not only was that on talk radio, but Larry King used to do it. So what's the secret of that, and how come there's not more of it?
Callers are diminishing returns. So the call screener needs to, so if I'm interviewing you, hey, Jason, what do you want to talk to John about? And I have to get it out of you. And then I have to really try and coach you and go, okay, when you get on, don't bother saying hi. Don't say, thanks for taking my call. He knows we really appreciate it. I want you to open up, and I just want your first sentence to be, hey, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Now, I'm still on a tightrope because you might get on the air and be like, hey, thanks for taking my call. And it just drags everything to a halt. Unless you have a really good caller, you just want to take their initial point and fade them out. And you don't need them other than to facilitate a discussion point. That said, back in the day, there were regulars who knew how to do it, but most civilians can't tell a story.
Interesting. Okay. No, that makes sense.
Saturday Night Live turning 50. Will Lorne Michaels stick around? I'm looking at this and going, take the victory lap. You're 80, 81 years old. It's not going to get any better. I don't see anyone going, season 52 was great, Lorne. I think you got to get out here. People who know him, like Seth, seem to think he's going to stick around. What do you think?
The short answer is I don't know. But as you say, the people who are closer to it than me think he's sticking around. And the people who know him better than I do think he's sticking around until he can't do it anymore. And it's such a hard thing to replace him. I think much harder than people realize, that I don't think, and God knows no one's going to push him out. So I guess he'll still be, but who knows? We'll see. Look, we're all going to have to be thinking and writing and talking about SNL next year.
For a year.
A lot more. Let's not do it now, because we're all going to have to do it next year a lot.
Will Ferrell, Tina Fey, and the top 13 SNL.
Get ready for all. There's people who are going to have to watch every episode of all 50 years. We're going to have to write lists. There's a book. The Lorne bio is finally going to come out next year.
Oh, wow.
By Susan Morrison from the New Yorker. That's probably like the most anticipated comedy book of next year. And I imagine that will be a big doorstop with all sorts of comedy dirt in it. Even if it wasn't the 50th anniversary, that would be a big source of conversation.
Did you see this thing? I'm sure you did. With Kimmel and Letterman developing a talk show for Lunel. I just saw that before I jumped on with you. That's like a real life Hacks episode. I looked it up. She's 65. And when I watched Hacks, my initial reaction, and they addressed it, was like, they're not going to give Deborah Vance a show at her age. And here we are living a Hacks episode.
Yes, I did see that. Well, I'll believe when I see it. But I think, why not? I feel like she's one of these people who've been around for a long time. I think I saw her open for Cat Williams at Barclays a little while ago. I just saw her pop up in a movie from like the 90s. Anyways, I think she's paid her dues. She deserves a show, just like Deborah Vance does.
All right, 3 hours ago, I asked you if Nikki Glaser has stepped up in class.
I think that she was probably the big winner of the Netflix weekend. I think, although it's funny, I think there's what was interesting about her week is she was the star of the roast on Netflix, and then she released a special on HBO Max, and which raises the question, why didn't Netflix have that special? And I do think that points to another issue, which looking to the future, which are these other streamers going to start to eat into Netflix's territory? And the fact that they didn't have Nikki Glaser, which they did have her previous special, and she clearly is still a figure on their streamer, was interesting to me. Did she raise the class? Yeah, I think so. But she's been steadily building for a while. Her reality show is doing well. She has an incredible. First of all, I find her very incredibly consistent, amazing work ethic, talented in a lot of different ways. She's somebody who I think could go in a different direction with a special. Could be more. On talk shows, she's so good and so revealing and so introspective. And on specials, she is sometimes, but she's usually just like a killer joke, just an incredible joke teller. I feel like if you could sort of merge those two things, she'd have a real blockbuster.
It was a weird week of press. She crushed so hard on the roast. There was no buzz on the special. It was very strange. The special kind of came and went, and people are still talking about the roast.
I think that's partly has to do with just Netflix and also roasts. That roast got so. Although I don't know, I maybe you can know more than I, but I feel like I saw conflicting reports about the ratings. That's another example of something that was like an hour too long. That if it was not live, there's no question it would have been edited down an hour and would have been better, and probably I would assume would have got higher ratings. But I saw some reports that it got crazy ratings. I saw some others that Cat Williams got better ratings. Who knows? But I think her special didn't do worse because of that roast. I think because it's like you're saying before, there's still a ton of people who don't know who Nikki Glaser is.
Right.
He's a tremendously successful stand-up comedian, but that roast still raised her profile because it was a thing that everyone was talking about and it was trending for days.
So ratings-wise, I think I saw what you saw the first weekend, that more people watched Cat, quote-unquote, live than the roast. But I saw something last night that, vague numbers here, 239 million views, eyeballs, whatever the Netflix metric is on day one, but it held that number all week. So it seemed like it had legs off the buzz. I think part of Nikki, and you brought up Netflix versus HBO Max, they've goofed up the brand. So this week, Hannah Einbender has a new special. Normally, HBO specials come out Saturday at 10 p.m. and Hannah's is out on a Thursday. And then I started wondering, so is this not an HBO special? Did she get a Max special? And what the heck does that even mean? And does it matter? And it's confusing. Most civilians aren't going to care, but I just looked at it and I'm like, so is this special somehow, I don't mean this is dig, but like lesser? It's not the equivalent of a Saturday night HBO special from back in the day. It's a Thursday Max special. I don't know. They've confused me.
Yes. No, I think they've given up a lot of the prestige of their brand. That said, and clearly like the company is not doing well. They're going to lose Charles Barkley and inside the NBA that are in debt, right? That said, all right, let's try to defend them a little bit, which is that what I think they're trying to do, which is the smart move, that they can't compete with Netflix in terms of money and in terms of scale. And now you got Hulu coming in, which is going to have a big special every month. And they've already signed up people like Gaffigan and Sebastian Maniscalco. What Max is doing is, I think, is trying to get the kind of slightly artier Gerard Carmichael, Julio Torres, Hannah Einbinder. They're not going for the biggest mass appeal in a way that I think is consistent with their traditional brand writ large, but it doesn't mean the same thing that it did in the 70s when they had the whole market to themselves, or the 90s when they had Chris Rock and it was like a major event. Those days are gone. So now the big events tend to be on Netflix. So what do you do if you're a secondary streamer? And I think they have a decent strategy. And that's, I think, what I like. I agree with your point that it's a mess and confusing to be a consumer of comedy these days and to find where everything is. And I think in a couple of years, it's going to look different. And what I hope it looks like is that each of these platforms has a personality, has a style, and people who want that can go there, right? What it will probably be will not be that, will be a mess. So that's why I like the fact that that Max, even though it's not Friday, seems curated with a specific taste.
Well, they had, even in this century, maybe not for comedy, but for drama shows, they could have thrown this conversation on Sunday night at 9 p.m. and people would have sampled it and assumed it was prestige. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But we would have gotten the goodwill off the first episode. People would have tuned in.
That's true. That's true. No, it's interesting. I didn't realize about that hers was coming out on Thursday. I wonder why.
All right, let's take one more break here. Don't forget, you can get these shows ad-free, $4.99 a month. Gets you this and all the other things on the network. Link in the show notes. Go to calaroga.com/plus. Check it out. Maybe you can help me sort my feelings here. I've been struggling with this one. As close as I've gotten is special versus hour. So every comedian tweets out, hey, check out my new special on YouTube. And if we graph everything out, at one end, I don't know, there's Carlin at Carnegie. And at the other end, I happen to have a still camera at the Chuckle Hut Tuesday night at 10 p.m. And everyone's using the word special. And I've got a new special. I don't even know what I want from you, but help me. Not everything is a special.
It's very fuzzy these days, right? Here's my glass half full version. I feel like it's the best of times, the worst of times. There's more specials than ever now, or more releases than ever. And the good part of that is the funniest comedy out there doesn't tend to be the most famous people. For totally boring reasons. They have other things to do than work on their jokes, right? They're busy, right? So the people who tend to have the most worked out jokes are the kind of mid-career comedians who have trouble getting a Netflix deal, right? And now they have a place and an outlet to release their stuff, YouTube, right? So you see people like Nathan McIntosh, or the next one I saw is Renan Hirschberg, or who has one coming up soon, Liz Meal. We're in a time where these people now, you can see their stuff not only as easy as you can see the stuff on HBO, but easier. And I think that's a good thing. And I don't want to say, that's not special and this is special, because not only is it not true that they're worse, they're in many cases, they're often better. But two, it's like, what's the point in policing these genres? I do think we'll look back and we'll say, man, there was more bad comedy then than ever, but there's also more great comedy than ever. It's harder to find the good stuff now because there's so much of it. And that's part of our job, is to be like, hey, all right, everybody knows Joe Rogan and the roast and all this, but that's not really the best comedy. Nobody who knows comedy thinks that's the best comedy. That's increasing to the point that we started with, which is like, all right, how have our jobs shifted? We've got to cover the big stuff because that's what people want to read and that's important. But I think we have an increasing responsibility to be like, okay, let's look at what's going on on YouTube, on TikTok, et cetera, and find the good stuff.
You've been incredibly generous with your time. Let me pick your brain and I'll let you go about comedy snobbery. When I ran serious comedy, so I'm sitting at a desk 5 days a week, got the radio on from 8 to 6. All I'm hearing is the best stand-up comedians performing their best material that they've pressed. And it fried my brain, and I call it the Emperor of Rome syndrome. So if I go see a show, I don't laugh. I'm now a psychopath, but my brain is analyzing and going, oh, that's hilarious. And I'm thinking it just in the manner I did. Oh, that's really funny. Oh, great callback. Oh, wow, this is an awesome set. Has doing what you do, has it fried your brain?
It's a really good question. The short answer is yes, that when it becomes your job, first of all, if you see comedians in the back of comedy clubs, they don't laugh.
Right.
The way regular people do. And it's no different than people like you and I, who often, you're not the best audience member. In fact, one weird phenomenon of my job is I feel bad. Sometimes I think something's funny, but I don't laugh. And I know it makes me a bad audience member. Sometimes I fake laugh, just like if I'm in a small room where the laugh really matters, or having someone stone-faced is like going to disrupt the proceedings. Like I'll fake laugh, which I'm not as convincing as a fake, which comes off ridiculous. You do what you do. But so I do think that it's a danger of the job, which is and it's something you have to be aware of and you have to factor in, because you want to be in touch with both your honest reaction to something and also how the ordinary consumer receives the stuff. It's self-justifying, but I tend to think that the advantages of being experienced and well-versed in comedy and knowing the vast sweep of the history of the form and seeing enough to know what's good versus bad, what's ambitious versus not, what's predictable, what's cliche, all that stuff outweighs the negative of not laughing quite as much. And I also will say this, that like the moment when you aren't excited about seeing something, the moment when you get cynical or jaded about comedy is when I'll quit. So that's something you got to always be kicking the tires on, or I have to be kicking the tires on, which I do.
Have you ever run into, I ran into this early in my career, not so much lately, but hey, you're not a comedian. How come you're doing this and all this? And I was just explaining, like, I don't play guitar, but I can recognize that Eddie Van Halen's pretty good at it. Like, I'm not claiming to be a comedian. I'm a dude in a basement, or I was a radio programmer. I don't know.
Yeah, that doesn't bother me. If anything, I consider it a benefit, a plus, because in fact, you'll never find me doing the gimmick piece of, and then I went and tried stand-up and I bombed and I learned how much I respected. But no, to me, respecting the artist, whether it's a comedian or whether it's a theater artist or a film artist, is becoming as good as I can be at my job, which is fundamentally different. Like comedians are good at what they do. And what I do is quite hard as well. And it also looks easy, right? Just doing comedy is easy or looks easy, but is actually incredibly hard. Being a critic covering an incredibly diverse, complicated field and then translating that into prose that both the expert and the casual fan can understand without limiting the complexity of it and nuance, that's very tricky. And that's enough of a challenge for me. And I actually tend to think that not being a comedian helps me in that job. Besides the fact it reduces the conflict of interest and keeps your independence, et cetera. But I think that it's a fundamentally different skill set. And so when people say, oh, you're not a comedian, I said, that's right, I'm not a comedian.
Yeah, 100%. Sorry, when I was programming the stations, and I still program for Live One, I wanted to make sure I was coming in at civilian eye level, and the civilians are listening to Jim Gaffigan. You and I can go to a club and be too cool for school and deep dive, but it's the same thing I brought up 9 times, but play the hits.
No, you got to, look, I don't understand people who do at my job. I know there's some of them who say this, and I respect a lot of them, or I respect all of them. It's hard. This is a hard job. But my audience my primary audience is the reader. And I don't see the comedy world as not my community. I'm a journalist who's working in my audience is the reader. I have obligation to be fair to the artists, and I hear from them, and I know like I want their respect as I want anybody else's respect. But I do think it's important for people, just as I think it's important for comedians to see their audience, their primary audience, not their only audience, but their primary audience, as their people sitting in front of them or watching their special, I have to think about what the reader wants first. And when I get away from that, I think I run into problems. So yeah, I think and there's room. People have different points of view on this, but yeah, it's funny because I'm a critic, but I'm also a reporter. So I talk to comedians, interview them. I learn a lot from that. That helps me understand what they're trying to do. There's value in that, but there's also value in independence and distance. And you sometimes can see, and comedians frankly understand this better than other artists because they're often critics of whatever, social conditions, politics, whatever. And they can often diagnose something more perceptively than people in the news can or journalists can, because they have a little more distance. So distance can be an advantage as well.
And it keeps you out of the fights. I don't have to name particular names. There are comedians who do really well and aren't respected by the brick wall cigarette smoking crowd in the Village. And I will name names. I worked with the blue collar guys. Larry the Cable Guy, Dan, is the nicest guy you'll ever meet, unless Jeff Foxworthy's in the room. They are awesome people. And, I've been backstage with them, and Larry would write Jeff a joke that just didn't work for Larry's act, and Jeff would write something a little naughty and pass it back and forth. And they're just trying to make people laugh. They're not going, oh, Larry the Cable Guy, this is high art. Like, it's just jokes. And some of that, especially in New York, that bitterness about somebody else's success would get fatiguing.
You know what else? Larry the Cable Guy is good at what he does. When I wrote about them, I made a point of, I went to Beaumont, Texas to see that tour. I wanted to go to like there, and I watched all of them. And Larry, I believe, came last. And I think that was the right move because he's a killer, and he has an incredibly dense, punchline rich set. Not every joke is great, but if you don't like it, another one's coming down the pike fast. It's not like the hippest, obviously, brand of comedy, and it's a character-driven comedy, which it feels you don't see it quite as much in the clubs as you used to. But anyways, I think it's the kind of journalism that I do, and not everyone has to be like this, but I try to have Catholic tastes. I try to meet artists where they are. That doesn't mean that everything is equally good, but I think that's part of the fun of the job, is seeing artists of wildly different genres, aesthetics, ambitions. That's what makes this fun to follow.
I love that you went to Beaumont. When I first put together Blue Collar Radio, the first time I met them, I went to see a show. The show was in Nashville, and I specifically asked them, please don't VIP me. Put me in the upper deck with the civilians. And I sat there and I paid attention, and I was just trying to take the vibe in. And I always remembered the two things that got big applause were, y'all ever been to the Walmart? A mention of Jimmy Buffett and a mention of Elvis. Right. And I factored that into my programming, whereas the Raw Dog channel was, if it were a person, maybe it would be Bill Burr, and it had a real, FU and a rock and roll kind of vibe. And Blue Collar Radio was God, flag, country, veterans, straight to apple pie, Cracker Barrel, straight down the middle, and it did tremendously well.
Yep. No, it's true. And that's one of the great things about stand-up, is that you've got all these like regional forms that do well. Sometimes I worry that the internet's sort of flattening that out. And I wrote a story last year about how the internet hurting distinct local scenes, because there used to be like Boston had a specific aesthetic that you could associate. San Francisco, which was different than San Francisco, which was different than DC, which was different than Nashville. But now, since everyone is in the same room together online, this idea of, oh, the comedians in my scene are the only ones I know coming up is obsolete. And is that going to sand off the edges of local difference? And I don't know. I've talked to some people in various local scenes who suggest that's happening.
And there's so much out there. We're nearly an hour in, and we've really only talked big comedians. We haven't talked alt. We didn't talk improv. We didn't talk sketch. We didn't talk one-person shows. Like somebody like Natalie Palomini is just doing amazing work. There's just so much out there.
I just saw her new show, which I'll be honest with you, I was like, how can she top Nate? But I saw her new show, which at the Netflix Festival in LA, and it was the best thing I saw there. It wasn't finished, but it was thrilling. And I can't wait to see it when it's done. It's basically like a rom-com where she plays both parts of this romance. And the physicality of it is just incredibly inventive. I've never seen anything like it. The whole clowning scene is booming.
Oh, that's just great. Jason, you've been very generous with your time. I hope you'll come back down the road when there's an excuse for me to ask you to come on again, other than just, hey, man, want to fill an hour for me? But this was fantastic. Thank you.
This was incredibly fun. Thank you for asking. And it's great to have a conversation with someone who knows their stuff.
He was fantastic. I enjoyed the heck out of that. He was very gracious with his time. On this program tomorrow, a look at the best comedy specials of the year so far. See you then.